I'm Katie. I'm one of the curriculum managers at Oak. My background is 24 years in a primary classroom and 3 months at Oak, which in terms of Oak terms is quite a long time because, of course, it's only been going 9 months, and it was originally set up to cope with the first lockdown and provide resources for teachers and pupils across the country. And it's just snowballed. And of course, the situation that schools are currently in, it's in great demand. I've got some figures, data figures that absolutely blow my mind if you're interested. My first figure is that we are likely next week to cross the 100 million lessons being accessed, which is absolutely amazing. The day-on-day increase just blows my mind. In the first week of January, so that first week of the lockdown, 81 million minutes of video was delivered, which actually equates to 154 years in that 1 week, which every time I hear that figure, it just absolutely blows my mind with, do you know how well used it is and how much teachers and families are valuing it and how it's really helping with such difficult times that families and pupils and schools are in at the moment.
Yeah, they are astonishing numbers, aren't they? And the chance to make that sort of impact must be amazing. So could you give us a bit of a description of what a typical Oak lesson looks like, Katie?
Yes. So the big thing to make clear about the Oak lessons is that we use the asynchronous format. So it's pre-recorded, it can be accessed at any time. It's different to the synchronous method, so the method where you might use Zoom or Teams to live teach your children, and the teachers can provide tailored feedback. The learners can ask questions there and then. They can often follow their own school timetable. We at Oak produce asynchronous lessons, and the advantages for that are that learners can review at their own pace. The flexibility for when learning takes place. We find this is particularly important for families with multiple siblings and limited devices. It can be matched to ability levels. There's less chance for technical difficulties impacting on the lessons. The lessons can be accessed repeatedly. So the Oak lesson format is that most lessons have a video and they have a slide deck. There are intro and exit quizzes for older age groups. For the younger age groups, this activating prior knowledge is done at the beginning of a lesson within the video lesson. We find the younger age groups struggle with that actual task of getting into the quiz and reading the questions and answering them. So we have the teacher do it in the video lesson, and then there are exit quizzes at the end to check on lesson progress. Our aim is to replicate the phases of a classroom lesson as closely as possible in this asynchronous setting. So we have in the video, there'll be explanations of the topics, there's questions to ensure there's understanding, and it's followed by practice tasks. And then they follow up with the exit quiz at the end. The part of Oak that's less well used is when you go onto the homepage, there's a button at the top that says Teacher Hub. And if teachers go into that, they can actually access all the resources separately so that they can download the transcript of what the teacher actually says during the lesson. They can download any worksheets that are being created. They can have a look at the lesson video. So I think that's a really useful aspect for teachers to be able to use to build their own lessons that suit their setting and the learners they're delivering to.
And then amongst all those hundreds of millions of hours of learning, have you begun to get a sense of what the most effective lessons look like, and how do you know what's the data that you get from that?
Yeah, so obviously we're collating a terrific amount of data on these lessons that these users are accessing, and we're just at the very early stages of having a look at what the lessons are telling us. But certainly from working with our teachers to create lessons, there's some key things that we're finding make the best asynchronous lessons and the most effective. The first one I like to say is more, more, more. So teachers are used to adapting their lessons to their learners and scaffolding where appropriate. And of course, when you're teaching asynchronously and you're pre-recording your videos, you can't do that. You can't tailor the explanations. So we find that more scaffolding is needed than would be in an ordinary lesson. That checking for understanding needs to be done more often, and practice tasks need to be done more often. We use something called pause points at Oak, which are the sort of the written form of a teacher asking a question and children responding. Another thing that teachers often forget when they're doing these asynchronous lessons is they forget to provide the answers. So that's something that we have to be really mindful of, and how important that is so that children receive that feedback. The other thing we're finding with our lessons is that less is more. So there's a tendency when you're pre-recording a lesson to replace learner interaction with teacher talk instead. And we're finding that generally shorter lessons are more likely to be completed. The data doesn't show such a massive difference, which I'll talk to you about later, but it does show there's some difference, and that shorter lessons generally are more likely to be completed. We find that when teachers script their exposition, it clarifies and sequences their thinking, and that makes explanations and instructions much clearer and more precise and concise. Teachers make less mistakes when they're filming shorter lessons, and that means, of course, there's less takes needed, and that has massive workload implications. We find that using minimal text on a slide is really important. The same with images. So images are used that are integral to learning and not just to make the slide look pretty. And in that way, we're ensuring learners are not presented with too much information. We also use transitions where we chunk the information and it comes onto the slide on the video, one chunk at a time. And we find because we're minimizing the amount of text, we're able to maximize the size of the text, which actually is something we found is even more important than you'd imagine, because so many learners are accessing these lessons on a small mobile phone screen. So the size of the text is really important. And the last thing I think that we've learned that's really important, it's something our principal, Matt Hood, calls Super Blue Peter. We found that lessons are most successful when the teacher is like a Blue Peter presenter, but 10 times more so. So they're really enthusiastic, they're really engaging. That first 5 minutes of the lesson is so important to engage the learners and get them involved. So we encourage for that first part of the lesson that teachers do full screen video introductions, so the learners get to build that relationship straight away.
That's such a great list, Katie. I'm sure that'd be really helpful to people sort of doing these things themselves as well. And then I guess on the other hand, you must also have learned perhaps what's not so effective. I mean, are there particular changes that you've made as a team to how you plan and deliver these lessons, perhaps from the first lockdown to the current lockdown, for example?
So all those things that I've just listed there are all things that we've used to help us constantly improve the quality of our lessons. I think we had some hypotheses about the data that we're collecting, so we were quite keen to look at things, and actually it's really interesting what we're finding. So we had thought that the longer the lesson, the lower the completion rate. At Oak, we class a lesson as being completed if 75% of the video has been watched. We found the difference is quite small. So although we still feel that shorter lessons are better and more effective, the data doesn't massively drop off the longer the lessons get. We also wondered whether primary lessons would have a higher completion rate, because there's probably more parental involvement and therefore they get to the end of the lesson. And we actually found that that wasn't the case at all. The one bit of data that really stood out clearly is that lesson completion is massively linked to the teacher. more than any of those other features, the teacher and the ability of the teacher to engage the children is what indicates the completion of the lessons. So we're currently trying to work out, how do you measure Super Blue Peter? What does that look like? What features are included? How do you compare lessons based on that? So it's quite interesting discussions really for how you do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and we've done some research of our own actually for various organisations, and that idea of the teacher's presence, it's universal whether you're online or in the classroom. That's really that's come through. You touched on it a little bit there in terms of what you're discussing, but are there any big differences you're seeing between phases or subjects, the sort of in the content or how people are using them, I guess, either side?
So from November, I've been working very closely with teachers to create lessons to expand our curriculum, and the areas we've looked at are areas that teachers were crying out for, but were more tricky in the thinking about how we present these lessons asynchronously. So I'm talking about art, design, technology, PE, drama, subjects that don't naturally lend themselves to that pre-recorded setting, one person in their living room recording a lesson. And we found out lots of things about those different subjects that really support that being able to be presented to learners. So the big thing is how important it is to limit the equipment that needs to be used for the lessons. So the majority of our lessons only need a pen and paper. That's incredibly tricky if you're trying to do a design and technology lesson or an art lesson. So we've had to be really creative about using things that are available to children around the house. The one exception is cardboard, because the feedback we've received is that most houses seem to be swamped in sort of packaging from deliveries that they've received. So our new design technology lessons that released last week are very, show really creative use of cardboard for a whole different range of settings. The other sorts of things that we found were things like trying not to be too specific. So we've got some cookery lessons on there, and we've tried wherever possible to sort of say that you need vegetables for this lesson rather than saying you must have a potato and a carrot. So to try and make it available to a wider audience and not to disadvantage children who didn't have the specific things that they needed. In both art and design technology, they've used visualizers for whole screen demonstrations, and they're really effective in being able to show children exactly what is expected and the steps to go through to achieve that piece of work. The other issue we had was lack of space available to the learners that are following these lessons at home, and that was particularly challenging for PE and drama. PE have cleverly used camera tracking equipment so they can move around, but it still keeps them in the same screen, which is really helpful. And drama have had to focus more on a teacher in role to inspire, because obviously they haven't got that group work dynamic that they would normally have in their lessons. The same with PE. They've had to really develop the skills in personal challenges, because they're not able to offer that teamwork that you'd normally have in a PE lesson. So it's been really interesting working with those teachers and those subject leads in sort of trying to determine what makes a great asynchronous lesson for those creative subjects.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned earlier that the assumption that perhaps there's a difference between primary and secondary, whether it's just that the parents are more involved versus being older children being more independent. Are there any big differences or specific challenges you're seeing within the differences between the phases?
We haven't found a massive difference in engagement. It's been very similar engagement levels throughout the year groups, which I think we were surprised at. Our biggest user group is Key Stage 2. That stands out as being our biggest user group. I'd say the biggest thing that's been really lovely to see is that children engage in the same way. So what we found is at primary level, the children almost forget the teacher isn't there live, and they shout answers. And when they're asked to hold up their work, they hold up their work and show the teacher. And when the teacher's proud, you can, we video children watching lessons, and you can see the child beam with pride too, which is absolutely gorgeous. Lovely to see it primary, but we're seeing it at secondary as well. So we're finding, because that peer pressure has been removed in the classroom, teenagers are engaging, and they're shouting out answers, and they're joining in really interactively with the lesson as well, which was lovely to see, really a real positive.
Yeah, that's great. And then again, I think you've touched on this slightly, but how are schools and teachers making use of Oak? So sometimes it's used by parents at home, other times it's structured within the work that schools are setting. What are you seeing there?
So a whole different way that schools are using it. They've definitely used our resources to suit their learners and to suit their settings, and constantly hearing stories of how creative schools are in the way that they do it. I think an awful lot of schools are using that blended approach. So they're having synchronous lessons that they're providing. They're also having asynchronous lessons for children without access to online. They're printing some of our resources, and because we've got lesson transcripts, the child can literally follow through the same journey of the lesson with the same information as any child who's following the video. We're finding that some schools are putting like links on their website, so children can almost, at Key Stage 3, children can follow the same timetable, and that's what they're being asked to do. If you've got science now, go and look at our science links, and that's the way they're accessing it. We're finding that some schools are doing sort of a Zoom synchronous lesson, but they're introducing it and giving the children a pre-teach they need. They're then showing an Oak lesson video, but pausing it at certain points and adding in further questioning, which I think is a great way to extend the use of the resources. But I think the thing that has really interested us is the uses beyond COVID. So the resources were very much set up to provide for children's remote learning at home, but actually schools are using it beyond that. They're using it for catch up, they're using it for homework classes, they're using it for supply cover. So when someone's delivering a lesson that is beyond their specialism, they're leaning on the Oak resources to make sure that that same level of quality as if the teacher, the specialist who was in the room was there, is being delivered. And the other thing that they're using it for is CPD. So they're looking at the delivery of lessons. We're seeing this is being used increasingly by trainee teachers who, of course, unfortunately at the moment have had a really rough time. They can't get into schools, they can't get that wide breadth of experience, and they're able to access what a lesson looks like. They're being set up with the lesson to view, and then they're having group discussions where they look at what's great about the delivery of this lesson, what would you change. Obviously, we don't provide the behaviour management and those aspects, but in terms of being able to see a breadth of teaching, it goes towards supporting those trainee teachers, which is a really creative use, I think, of our resources.
Yeah, and it is an amazing resource, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure once we get through this and step back and look at that as a library of information, there's going to be all sorts of things that can be done with it. And then I wonder if drawing on the experience you've had with Oak, what would be the, I don't know, 2 or 3 top tips you'd give to someone, a teacher, as they're trying to set up, design their own online lessons, I guess particularly asynchronous lessons?
I think the tips that I just mentioned before, I think would really support in creating a really good quality asynchronous lesson, so that more of everything that good quality teachers do anyway in their classes, more than you think. So the number of questions you think you asked, double what you ask in this lesson. The less text, less images, really important, and how important the Super Blue Peter is to really engage your learners and keep them engaged in that lesson.
That's really helpful. And then for you, as a teacher, what an exciting project. What's been the biggest lesson for you personally from your experience of being involved in Oak?
I think rather than a lesson, it's something that I'm constantly reminded of every day at Oak, is the innovation and creativity of teachers. Do you know, it doesn't matter the difficulties that they're having in schools and the difficulties that families are going through that they're supporting. They're finding such creative ways to use what's already available, and when it's not, they're creating their own. And just the way they go absolutely above and beyond. You know, we've got teachers that work with us that work full time during the day and then put hours and hours of time in the evening to create resources because they want to support all children across the country, and they have that sort of common view that we really need to provide for everyone, and that all children are entitled to good quality education, and that they want to support in accessing that. And every day I'm in absolute awe of, you know, the workload that's increased for teachers currently in school is absolutely massive. And then to find on top of that increase in workload time to create really high quality resources for Oak, I just think is incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. Hats off to people. Katie, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm sure people find that really useful. Yeah, and good luck with the rest of the year on Oak.
Thank you.